our moderator tonight, Andrew Kirby, who's one of our councillors, one of our young councillors from the USI of the ACT. Andrew is experienced in planning, policy, strategy and leadership, and he has a diverse background both in and out of the military. He's held a number of leadership roles as well as being selected for a number of high-profile staff and representational appointments. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, John. Well, gentlemen, ladies, good evening. As John just said, my name is Andrew Kirby from the Council of the United Service Institute. So welcome to the first of three sessions we're running in preparation for the Defence White Paper. Joining me tonight, I think, is a very distinguished panel, faces who I'm sure you're all familiar with. So starting from my left is Gary Humphries, former Federal Senator and ACT Chief Minister. Gary served in the ACT and Commonwealth Parliaments for almost 25 years. First elected to the Legislative Assembly in 1989 at the inauguration of self-government for the Territory. Gary is a former shadow front bencher in the Defence portfolio. Also, Peter Leahy, the Foundation Director of the National Security Institute at the University of Canberra. Peter retired from the Army in July 2008 after a 37-year career as a soldier, concluding his career in the Army with 6 years as Chief of the Army, making him the longest-serving incumbent in the position since General Strivel in the 1920s. In 2007, Peter was elevated to the Companion of the Order of Australia. From my right, we have John O'Callaghan. John's the Executive Officer of the Australian Industry Group Defence Council and has held a number of positions over the last 15 years, including Assistant Secretary of the Capital Equipment Coordination Department of Defence. And to my right, recently joining us is Chris Uhlmann, a face familiar, I'm sure, to most of you as a political editor for ABC's 7:30. Chris previously co-hosted 666 ABC Canberra's top-rating breakfast program, produced mornings on 774 ABC Melbourne, and worked as the Chief Political Correspondent for ABC Radio Current Affairs. Just a few remarks before we begin. Tonight we're presenting a hypothetical scenario. We're in a panel of distinguished experts, that's you four gentlemen. We'll debate and formulate policy advice to government in the face of a series of cumulative scenarios. So we'll work through 5 different little pocket scenarios that move forward in time and hopefully aggregate towards a picture or a few conclusions at the end. The scenarios, I must stress, are hyperbolic, so they're, if not worst case, they are worse case, and they're intended to provide a framework to explore different policy settings that government may wish to consider in the next white paper. I do stress they do not represent my views, the USI's views, or indeed any of our panellists' views. We'll conduct this session for about 45 to 50 minutes. Chris has kindly volunteered to do a summation at the end, after which there will be the opportunity for questions from yourselves, members of the audience. Please do note, particularly for those who've been to the USI or other such sessions before, the Chatham House rule is not in effect tonight, so everything should be taken as attributable and on the record. And indeed, we're very kindly, the Staff College has agreed to film tonight's events, and it may be published on the Institute's website, and copies of proceedings will be provided to the Defence White Paper Community Consultation Panel for their consideration. So, gentlemen, we'll begin. I'll take you forward to 2018. The worst anticipated scenario of Australia's fiscal position has now occurred. The Australian mining boom has drawn to a close as a result of rising Australian export prices and new supply chains opening up within various African and Asian nations. The unemployment rate has now increased to 10%, which is the highest since 1978, and youth unemployment has soared to 20%. Health and education are increasingly placing a burden upon government outlays and accordingly upon GDP. Media and lobby groups are calling for defence budgets to be cut in favour of health, welfare and education. The 2018 defence budget has increased to 1.9% of GDP. However, with the slowing Australian economy, many commentators are calling for it to be reduced back to 2014 levels of only 1.6%. Now, with an end to operational commitments in Afghanistan, Timor, and reduced demands from border protection, and a seemingly more peaceful region, we consider the options available to us. Gary Humphries, as a former member of the Howard government and a shadow defence front bencher, take us inside Cabinet and government's deliberations faced with declining revenues and increasing costs?
Look, if this is a Liberal government we're talking about in 2018, I just want to check on this. This is a very important distinction. I would say that you will find a lot of support for the concept that the 1.9% should be built over time still to the 2%, which has been articulated not just by the Liberal Party, but in fact by all Australian political parties in the last 12 to 18 months as their goal. Realistically, given the nature of the challenge that you've just postulated, Andrew, there will be tremendous pressures on that position. If the government's still chasing or has only just achieved a budget surplus, it will be very anxious to reach out for that holy grail or hold on to that holy grail. And it will be very difficult for the Defence Minister to roll into Cabinet and to defend the size of the defence budget. Not impossible, but with a seemingly calming in a regional situation, and a lot of money having been pumped into defence to reach the 1.9%, it will be very hard for the Minister to keep that money there.
Peter Lowe, you had the, quality problem of being Chief of the Army for 6 years during a period of intense operations and increasing defence budgets. What advice would you be providing to government with potentially decreasing revenues were you to be a service chief again?
I think there are two issues, and the first one is that whilst we're talking about a defence white paper, I think we should be putting in the context of a national security environment. So the elements of power that we have available to us are not just the military, it's diplomacy, there's the economy, and there's a range of other things. So I think we've got to consider it in a broader context. That's going to be pretty difficult. And I think the other thing to consider is that we have to make sure that we have a clear view of what we want to achieve as a nation. What are the issues? And we're going to have to prioritise them. I think the problem that we've experienced for most of Australia's history as a federation is that government has asked us to do everything, and they haven't funded us to that level. I used to think during my time that and I see some ex-service chiefs in the room as well, and hopefully they would agree with me, that government was after options. They weren't particularly after a solution. They just wanted to have a problem and then come up with a solution to it from the force in being. And I think when you're faced with this sort of situation with reducing budgets, government's going to have to make the hard decisions. Well, this is what we want. We'll fund you for that, and we expect you to be able to produce it. And why I mentioned the broader national security environment, I think we're going to find as we go further into these scenarios and we go further out, that those other agencies of government, such as the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, the Australian Federal Police, some of our intelligence agencies, they will have an increasing role to play in the broader national security environment and can provide very useful adjuncts to defence.
General Callaghan, we're talking specifically about defence from the departmental view here and the political view, but given the recent backlash to the JSF spend, how significant a part of the economy and employment in particular does defence spending play? And were the government to be contemplating cuts, what would you be saying?
Just paint the scenario first, obviously from a defence industry perspective, which is where I come from in my current role as Executive Director of the Australian Industry Group Defence Council. If we've got an unemployment rate of around 10% with youth unemployment at 20%, I'd be a bit nervous about the R word being thrown into the debate. That would be a very serious period for Australia's economy. That's the bad news potentially, but the good news, let me be fair, is that the coalition government in the pre-election period last year foreshadowed a growth in defence spending to 2% of GDP, as Gary pointed out, within 10 years. So if we've managed to get there by 2018, we're well ahead of the game, which suggests from a defence industry perspective, I suggest, that more's been happening than less. So from the point of view of Peter Lowe and others, particularly those with an army bent, that probably means that Land 400 is well on the way. that the future submarine program is pretty much locked in. Future frigates are locked in. And to pick up on your point about the Joint Strike Fighter, yes, there has been commentary about the expenditure in the period of a tough budget scenario, but I don't think you'll find too many complaints within defence industry nor within the wider defence and national security environment in regard to that expenditure. On the basis principally, and I did an interview on radio in Adelaide not long back in regard to this when I was asked the day after the decision to acquire the additional Joint Strike Fighters whether in fact that meant, for example, that we couldn't afford future submarines. And I made the point that from the point of view of defence budgeting, both those programs, amongst others, have been factored in over a long period of time. But I must say, just coming back to this issue of 10% unemployment, the last time Australia had that level of general unemployment, there was enormous pressure on all portfolios, and in particular in regard to the support that's given to unemployed people. So that would be a real worry in 2018 in the scenario, Andrew, that you've pointed to.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned all portfolios there, John, because I'll come to Chris now. And Chris, I think most people in the room have a fairly strong interest in defence. I would agree we probably see far more guests and panellists on your program speaking about domestic matters, the economy, health, education, etc., than we ever see about defence and strategic affairs. So, from your perspective, looking more broadly at the public debate, what challenges are the government going to have, and I guess what advice would you be providing?
Well, so it's 2018. The Abbott government has just crawled over the line at the 2016 election. Clive Palmer has shifted to the Senate, realising that he wouldn't win his seat in Fairfax again, but does hold the balance of power in the Senate. Tanya Plibersek is now leading the Labor Party, and it's shunted to the left. The states are screaming because the forward estimates have come through, and this money that's been taken from education and health is now beginning to bite hard into state government budgets. The problem for the Commonwealth is big, the problem for the states is actually larger, and it's now beginning to have an effect in hospital waiting times and what's happening in schools. Christopher Pyne's education program hasn't gone so well. The mothers are concerned about the fact that their children will be burdened forever with huge HECS fees. So in the environment that we're in, people look at a target of 2% of GDP for defence spending and think, where's the threat? So no threats materialise at this stage. We've seen by now that the Joint Strike Fighters are turning up in dribs and drabs rather than at the time we'd hoped for. Their performance is being questioned. Air warfare destroyers blown out. It's costing a whole lot of money. People are now talking about $45 billion for submarines, and we can't fill the 6 submarines that we've got with enough naval people on board. So it's reasonable for the community then to start to ask questions about why on earth are we spending money on this edifice when we don't see or feel the threat, and it seems to waste an enormous amount of money. So in that environment, a Defence Minister going into Cabinet would face an enormous amount of pressure. If you're looking at an unemployment rate of 10 or 20%, and you have, let's just think of a slogan that an opposition leader might use. You talk about defence and security of the nation, I want job security for my people. And you start to make an argument and get a drumbeat going in the community of that. 2018, so we're looking at an election in not too distant future. A government under enormous pressure, I think that the pressure on the defence budget would be extreme.
Well, it's
or it could be better than that.
that's fairly comprehensive. Well, Peter Lay, the Minister of Defence, has read the USI submission, has conducted community consultation, and asked him to his office for a chat and says, look, the hard word has been put on me by the Prime Minister and the other members of Cabinet. What can I do? What do I need to do?
The Minister's job is to deliver the budget, and I think they've been distracted in recent years, and I wouldn't be surprised if they're distracted in future years by a whole range of other things. So I think my first bit of advice to him would be, your job's to get the budget, and you're going to have to make the argument for it. And Chris is right when he talks about the threat, and I think in previous white papers we really haven't been able to define the threat strongly enough. We haven't been able to use the risk equation, that is likelihood and consequence, so I'd be asking him to make those sorts of equations. But I think in this sort of environment, he's going to have to start thinking about, and I think Defence has to start thinking about, literally pulling our heads in. I think we've tried to do too much. expeditionary operations all around the world, expeditionary operations in the China Seas. It might be that we have to further refine our approach and perhaps think that the near region, the Pacific and the Indian Oceans and the sea lines of communications that are more important to us. So I think the fundamentals of defence stay the same, that is a maritime approach with the ability to be able to do some other tasks. But we might purport that we're a creative middle power, but I don't think we have the ability to do that, that is, be a creative middle power. We'll look for the edges, and that is how do we make sure that our system of alliances, if you like, our system of preventive defence through diplomacy and other actions working in a broader national security environment are there. I think the other bit of advice I'd give the Minister is defence is a bit sick of taking the risk. The risk belongs to you, the politician. And if you look at the force that went to Timor, you look at the force that we deployed into Afghanistan and Iraq, I do think back to those days of the Second World War and the force that went up to Papua New Guinea. We can't accept from a government that they move the risk that they haven't accepted by funding us properly onto soldiers, sailors and airmen. So, Minister, you need to take the risk of either give us the money or pull your head in.
Gary Humphries, you've been called up to the Minister's office for a cup of coffee. As a lobbyist, you've been duly entered on every register known to man. What do I do, Gary, says the Minister.
Well, Minister, you need to roll into that Cabinet meeting and you need to pitch the best case you can. You are responsible at the end of the day for the success or failure of our array of forces designed to protect the nation and project whatever force into our region or beyond we feel we need to do in the national interest. We live in, with the possible exception of the Middle East, one of the potentially most volatile regions in the world, even if it's not particularly volatile right at the moment. And for Australia to pull back into a purely regional role, to lose that capacity for force projection, is a very serious diminution of Australia's role in the world. It's not just about defence, it's about defining ourselves as a middle power that works with other nations in a way that, that provides for greater international security and for values to be projected on potential conflicts around the world that hopefully resolves those things in favour of better outcomes, fairer outcomes, more democratic outcomes. So I would give the Minister that kind of argument to take into Cabinet, but give a pat on the back as he's going
black
through.
eye the next day and says, well, okay, that didn't work.
Yeah.
What's the hard decision you'd be recommending he make?
Well, a hard decision. I would say to the Minister that he needs to go back to... the first thing he needs to do is go back to defence and say, I've not won this battle. There's going to be a cut to defence spending over the forward estimates. You tell me what we can cut that gives us the best chance of retaining the most essential capacity within defence. If I don't get cooperation from the department, and I might not, because the departments, the Chief of Defence and the CDF are all protecting, the Secretary of Defence and the CDF are protecting their patch as well. I would say to him, well, what about land forces? What about armour? Do we really need a capacity for heavy armour in an environment where Australia hasn't used heavy armour for the better part of half a century, with I think, an exception in Vietnam briefly? Do we expect to be invaded by land anytime soon? If not, let's reduce that part of our, let's wither that part of our defence capacity on a temporary basis to get over this problem, and then we come back and we spend on things we really need to spend money on, which are our sea defences and our air defences.
Gary, I'm ready to go home. I've managed to get a straight and direct answer out of a former politician. I think my job here is done. So, Peter Lay, the political class have thrown it back onto defence and said, look, we need to find some cuts. You've been called in as an elder statesman of defence. Where do we find them?
Well, first thing I'd say is tanks save lives. And where did that lobbyist come from? I think it is a matter of prioritising. What do we want? Are we going to have these expeditionary operations? An army has been criticised for being an expeditionary force, but Navy and Air Force are just the same. If they're operating in the South China Seas or if they're operating in the Middle East, I think we have to figure out, are those in our direct national interest? And there's probably pain to be shared all around. I certainly don't agree that the army should be singled out, because if you do look at the most likely eventualities, they are, as General Rupert Smith said in his book, The Utility of Force, they are about war among populations. We're going to be seeing more humanitarian and disaster relief operations. We're going to be seeing more emergencies, and some of the scenarios we'll look at talk about climate change. We're going to see problems of terrorism. We're going to see problems of communities under stress, peacekeeping operations, and really it's a continuation of what we've seen in the last couple of decades. And the force with the most utility there are soldiers with boots on the ground with adequate armoured protection in case things escalate quickly. So I don't think the army stands as a single target. I don't particularly want to get into the numbers of other service organisations, but do we need to have large forces ready to go long distances operating at reasonably high scales with our allies, or perhaps do we go back to the days of Vietnam, where I think the political discussion about the size of the force to go to Vietnam was along the lines of a size so long as it is not contemptible. What is burden sharing with our partners? What can we get away with and how much we put forward?
So we're protecting land forces to a degree, casting our eye over the Navy and the Air Force. John, I'd be interested in your perspective, I guess from a broader industry view. Obviously, Navy and Air Force are particularly large spenders in the Australian economy, relatively speaking. What would you be saying to the Minister?
You've got to be a bit careful here. But it's not only Navy and Air Force which are large spenders, because in fact the Army with Land 400 alone, it's a significant, substantial amount of expenditure involved. And I should say in the last 24 hours, just to support one of Peter's comments there, I've been rereading General Monash's attack on the battlefield of Hamel, Roland Perry's biography, which I can thoroughly recommend. And one of the important elements of that battle was the use by Monash of armoured capability to support troops on the ground, which gave them the sort of protection which enabled them, among other things, to win a massive victory at the time. Having said that, of course, to pick up on the point that Gary made earlier, ministers and governments, particularly the National Security Committee, and for that matter the Expenditure Review Committee of Cabinet, needs to make choices. And one of the requirements of officials providing advice is to actually offer options for government. From a defence industry perspective, more not less is what we would like, if I put that parochial hat on. But there has to be a recognition that governments can't afford to purchase everything, so hard choices have to be made. But from an industry perspective, the fundamental key to assist proper, wise, prudent investment for the medium to longer term, 10, 20, 30 years out, is a degree of certainty. That's what provides the opportunity for boards and CEOs to make the wise decisions about investments. So the more clarity that can be provided by governments, particularly in difficult economic circumstances, about what is essential and what is likely to be acquired in the time frame to be acquired, is of great benefit to companies and to providing guidance to their shareholders about wise investment.
Chris, I might, rather than asking for your advice, I might indicate our Minister has suggested the advice he's received from the other three panellists. He's obviously now a guest on your program. What are the probing questions you're going to be putting to the Minister?
Scott Morrison is now the Minister for Defence.
I'll take that as a comment.
Not Prime Minister.
No, not Prime Minister. Julie Bishop's Prime Minister now. Scott Morrison is Minister for Defence, and the obvious question is you've failed to make the case as to why you need this amount of money in order to defend the nation. People aren't feeling a threat to, the threat that they're feeling is to their jobs. Their security threat at the moment is their jobs, their health system, their way of life, not to the shoreline. So why is it that we need all these big projects? Why is it that when you have these big projects, you don't ever be able to deliver them on time and on budget? So we've got a whole series of examples, and we know that defence capability is difficult, and it's, you know, this is cutting edge technology and all of that, but yet every single year we can throw up any number of examples of projects that haven't been delivered on time and on budget. So it's not even just that you're now demanding 2% of GDP, you don't even meet the targets that have been set. So again, in that environment, there'll be a whole lot of examples that you can throw up to a minister, which may or may not be fair necessarily, but people would see a clear argument that defence would appear to be wasting money that the nation can't afford.